your cell phone.
Hello and welcome, and thank you all for being here. A year and a half ago, with rising questions about the future of NAFTA, I was asked how we would respond. My answer was that we'd respond as Canadians always have in uncertain times. We'd be constructive and reasonable, but we'd also be firm. We'd protect our interests and promote our values. We'd show determination and also flexibility, and we would remain united. And ultimately, we'd emerge stronger. Well, that's exactly what we did. Last night, Canada reached an agreement in principle with the United States and Mexico on a modernized and updated North American Free Trade Agreement. It will now be called the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It's an agreement that, when enacted, will be good for Canadian workers, good for Canadian business, and good for Canadian families. It's an agreement that removes uncertainty for our manufacturers and investors and improves labor rights for all North Americans. And it's an agreement that will be profoundly beneficial for our economy, for Canadian families, and for the middle class. When we began the work of updating NAFTA, we kept our focus on what really matters. The new agreement would need to preserve jobs, foster growth, expand the middle class, and support people working hard to join the middle class. It also needed to be fair, which meant that it would have to preserve the fundamental principle of the original agreement, which is that when your trading partner is 10 times your size, you need rules. You need a level playing field. Unless the new agreement achieved those objectives, we wouldn't sign it. Well, simply put, the new agreement had to be good for Canada and for Canadians. Parce que la réussite des accords commerciaux.
Because the success of trade agreements is not measured with data or statistics, but by the way trade agreements help to improve people's lives, by their ability to protect the jobs we have and to create new ones, by the opportunities that our small and medium-sized businesses have to penetrate North American markets, by the new opportunities that will be afforded to those who work hard, and how available these opportunities are to everyone and benefit all. It must be said, modernizing NAFTA was no easy feat. Some said that it was impossible to do and that we should accept any deal. But that's not what we did. We insisted on obtaining a good deal. Like any important negotiation, we had to make compromises. And I tell you, some were more difficult than others. We never believed that it would be easy, and it wasn't. But today is a good day for Canada. It was by focusing on creating opportunities and growing the middle class that we got to where we are today. And by doing so, we preserved the major parts of NAFTA, those that foster the success of Canadian businesses and fairness for all.
Canada got here because we kept our focus and our collective resolve, even when some were recommending we capitulate. A word of caution. We're not yet at the finish line. This agreement still needs to be ratified in Mexico, in the United States, and in Canada. But what I can say is that free and fair trade in North America, a trading zone that accounts for more than a quarter of the world's economy, with just 7% of its population, is in a much more stable place than it was yesterday. We now have a path forward. This is an extraordinarily complex agreement, just as the original NAFTA was. But let me sum up what it means. It means that when this agreement is enacted, NAFTA will be preserved, updated, modernized, and stabilized for the 21st century, as we set out to do. It means Canadian workers and their families will enjoy greater opportunities than ever before. And more prosperity means more resources to invest in things like housing, healthcare, and a more secure retirement for our seniors. Alongside our new European and Trans-Pacific trade agreements, today we are securing a higher standard of living long into the future for the people of Canada. Before I ask Minister Freeland to get into some of the details of the agreement, I want to express my gratitude. We are very grateful to all the people from every corner of the country, from all walks of life, from all political points of view, who joined us in this effort, who supported and sustained it through the past 13 months. Especially and particularly, I have to thank every Canadian, and there were thousands of them, who wrote letters and emails and who stopped me in the street to say, "Keep at it, stay strong, we are with you." I want to thank the premiers, the leaders from industry and labor, Brian Mulroney and his original NAFTA negotiating team, and other former prime ministers, members of our NAFTA Council. Thank you all for your support, your advice, and your patriotism. Minister Freeland, Christia, for your tireless, relentless efforts, for your dedication, your hard work, not only in the past 5 weeks, but in the past 19 months. Thank you, and thank you to your family as well. I know, like so many of our families, Graham, Natalka, Halina, and Ivan missed you a bit, but knew you were doing extraordinarily important work. We owe you all a debt of gratitude. No minister in a generation has been given a more difficult task than this one, and you delivered. Chief Negotiator Steve Verheuel, who's here in the room with us, thank you, Steve, for being so extraordinary, so focused, and such a great Canadian. Everything you did, every step of the way, got us to this point. And David McNaughton in Washington, on the front lines of the conversations with Congress, with the administration, with stakeholders in the United States. David, you have been an extraordinary resource, friend, and a valuable asset to all Canadians as we've moved forward on this together. I also want to thank Ambassador Bob Lighthizer. He is a tough, principled negotiator, a veteran of 40 years of trade agreements, but he also understands and appreciates Canada. It's fair to say that this would not have come together without him. Likewise, the Secretary Ildefonso Guajardo of Mexico. Muchas gracias, mi amigo. I'd like now to turn it over to Christia. Minister Freeland.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. And thank you for your resolve and your leadership and your patriotism. They have been at the heart of our work and the foundation of everything. I'm really grateful. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to start by echoing the Prime Minister's sentiment and his thanks to everyone, above all, our outstanding trade negotiators. They are amazing, and I am very grateful, very, very grateful. And I also want to thank the trade negotiators from the other two countries. This has really been 24/7 for a lot of people for a long time. People have gone above and beyond the call of duty, and I'm really, really grateful. I said when we began that there would be moments of drama, and there have been. Through it all, Ambassador Lighthizer has been a professional, reliable, and trustworthy counterpart. And I can say, especially after the past few weeks of very intense negotiations, what we called our continuous negotiation, he's someone I consider a friend. Thank you, Bob. Mexico's Secretary Ildefonso Guajardo has likewise been a valued and respected counterpart, and I consider him to be a friend too. Muchas gracias, Ildefonso. So, here's what today's agreement will achieve. Tout d'abord, et c'est la chose la plus importante,
First and primarily, it maintains free trade across the North American continent and access to a regional market valued at $25 trillion, which boasts a population of 470 million and whose size has tripled since the creation of NAFTA in 1993. At the same time, it protects us from the threat of tariffs on our auto sector, which was looming over our economy, and thousands of good jobs, well-paying jobs, on both sides of the border. As such, this is a victory for Canadians. Furthermore, it maintains tariff-free access to the majority of Canadian exports to the American market. Now, this does not mean that we will not continue to diversify our trade throughout the world. We will obviously continue to do that, but this will allow us to consolidate our position on the North American market, one that is particularly important to us, while continuing to broaden our access to markets in other countries. This agreement is a good agreement for hundreds of thousands of Canadian workers. Not only does it preserve essential cross-border supply chains, but it significantly improves wages and rights of Mexican workers. Concretely, it is fairer for the auto workers in cities such as Windsor and Oshawa. It helps guarantee their future. This agreement also maintains the cultural exemption that was demanded by Canada, especially in the digital world, which protects our cultural industries and over 650,000 jobs across the country. It preserves our unique Canadian identity and our bilingual character.
Let me cite one of my favorite prime ministers, Louis Saint Laurent, who said in 1953, speaking of America, "We know it is not your wish to have on your border a mere replica of your own country, but rather a self-respecting community faithful to its own ways. We are thus better neighbors because self-respect is the key to respect for others." I think he put that very well. And there is something that is extremely important and of which I think we can all be particularly proud. Today's agreement fully upholds the impartial dispute resolution of Chapter 19 of the original NAFTA. When there's a disagreement over trade, it goes to an independent binational panel, and that panel gets to decide. Without Chapter 19, many of you will remember, there would have been no NAFTA in the first place. En fait, le Canada a eu recours à cette disposition.
In fact, Canada has used Chapter 19 a number of times. For example, during the softwood lumber dispute, to guarantee fair treatment of Canadian workers. The Prime Minister has said, and I would like to underscore this, that we must preserve trade based on rules. The United States are 10 times our size, and thus it was absolutely necessary to keep this dispute settlement mechanism, and we have done that. The dairy producers of Canada, their families, and their communities can count on the full support of our government. And that is something that has never wavered since the beginning of the negotiations. I will confirm this once again. This agreement preserves and maintains the supply management system. It means some freer access to markets, similar to what was agreed upon in CETA and the TPP. But the future of supply management is not challenged. To mitigate the impact of these changes, the government has promised our producers that they will be fully and fairly compensated for all loss of market shares. The government will also work with them to strengthen their industry even further. Furthermore, our consultations with dairy producers have convinced us to form a new working group with stakeholders in the industry to formulate a strategy that will allow us to maintain the vitality of our dairy industry for today and the future.
The original NAFTA contained a clause that eroded Canada's sovereign control over our energy resources, known as the Proportionality Clause. That's now gone. We also fought for and won administrative changes that will save the oil patch more than $60 million a year in burdensome fees and costs. The investor-state dispute resolution system that has allowed companies to sue the Canadian government is also gone between Canada and the United States. Known as ISDS, it has cost Canadian taxpayers more than $300 million in penalties and legal fees. ISDS elevates the rights of corporations over those of sovereign governments. In removing it, we have strengthened our government's right to regulate in the public interest, to protect public health and the environment, for example. We have a new enforceable environment chapter that upholds air quality and fights marine pollution. And pivotally, we have reached an agreement on cars and car parts, inspired by creative Canadian ideas, which, as some of you will remember, we put forward in our talks in Montreal back in January. That was a key turning point in this negotiation, and one which made all of the subsequent progress possible. Since the Auto Pact, Canada has been an integral and essential part of the North American auto industry with its highly integrated supply chains. We fought for that, and we have preserved it and created opportunities for growth. Let me turn it over back to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Chrystia. I'm looking forward to signing this agreement with Presidents Trump and Peña Nieto, and I really would like to stress this point. This will be good for workers in all three of our countries. Au cours des derniers mois, j'ai parlé avec des Canadiens.
In recent months, I worked with hardworking, upstanding Canadians in businesses across the country, and I would like to say we have heard you. In fact, once the binding provisions on labor rights come into force, this will be the most sweeping, progressive reform for North American workers in a generation. In addition, as a Quebecer myself, I know how important the cultural exemption is to preserving our identity and continuing to showcase our culture. Of course, the agreement also includes a number of other aspects that are very complex. Our team still has much work to do, and nothing is guaranteed yet because Canada does not decide what happens in the U.S. Congress or the Mexican Senate. There has been a great deal of uncertainty over the past year and a half, and I would like to tell you frankly that there are still some uncertainties. That being said, today's announcement is a major stride forward. This is the path that we must follow to usher in a new era of economic prosperity and stability in North America for the good of millions of people who depend on a thriving economy to meet the needs of their families and ensure a better future for their children. These negotiations are now behind us, and so we can move forward with the certainty that our economy is robust and that it will remain so as we continue to diversify our commercial trade with other world markets.
Along with CETA, our European trade deal, the CPTPP, our Trans-Pacific Accord, and Canada's other trade agreements, Canadians now benefit from free trade with 1.5 billion consumers around the world, representing 2/3 of the global economy. This is a very good position to be in. Add to this the fact that Canada is the only G7 country that has free trade agreements with every other G7 country. We will therefore continue to be extremely well placed for our businesses to reach new markets, hire new workers, and provide ever greater opportunities for Canadians. From Singapore to Kiev, from the northernmost point of the Americas to the southernmost, we are part of a global free trade network governed by rules that benefits consumers and workers alike. And the fact is, when it comes to trade, our businesses are thriving right now. Our merchandise exports hit an all-time high in June, the highest in our history. And middle-class families are benefiting from that success. Unemployment is at a 40-year low. These are the conditions we have preserved and will improve with this agreement. My friends, Canadians are among the most enterprising and innovative people on the planet. We have a lot more work to do, but we are on the right track. And we didn't get here by accident. Throughout these negotiations, we are, and we all, governments and Canadians, remained focused on what matters most, building opportunity for workers and for their families. Our government's purpose, first, last, and always, is to create the conditions to grow a stronger middle class and improve opportunities for Canadians. That is what we achieved today. It's an important step in the right direction, and it is something of which we and our partners can be very proud. I'm happy now to take your questions.
Okay, we're going to start off with one question, one follow-up as quick as you can, and I may interject to get you to do an answer from time to time in the other language, okay? Joyce Napier, CTV.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Good afternoon, Minister. I'm wondering how this will restore your relations with the White House.
I had a very positive call with the President this morning. There is no question that the question of NAFTA and renegotiating NAFTA has been a challenge in conversations with the President, with the administration over these past 13 months. But there is also no question that now that we have moved forward on a USMCA that is good news for all three of our countries, that we will continue to work on things that allow us to benefit our workers, benefit our citizens, and take on the world together as a North American market.
Minister Freeland, earlier Donald Trump spoke about what he called the power of tariffs, those that he imposed and those that he threatened to impose on his partners. And he said without tariffs, basically there would be no good trade deals. So he was intimating that basically he forced his partner's hands, or he played his partner. So did the threat of these tariffs weaken your hand?
Canada believes that the way you negotiate good trade deals is through fact-based arguments, and with the starting point that trade is mutually beneficial. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. So that is the approach that we take. We believe that a good trade agreement is a win-win agreement. It is an agreement that is going to create more jobs in both of the trading partners. That was the approach we took in CETA. That was the approach we took in CPTPP. And that has been our approach throughout the NAFTA negotiation. So we're a trading nation. We think trade is a really good thing. That's why we are really happy to have concluded this modernized deal with the United States and Mexico. And, our approach at the table is to make that point, to explain that this is about mutual benefit to all the parties to the agreement. And, of course, where there are different views, to look for those compromise positions. At the same time, Joyce, as I think has been clear throughout this negotiation, there are some matters that we have defined as being absolutely crucial to the national interest, and we've been very clear about that.
Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada.
Monsieur Trudeau, la classe politique québécoise dénonce
Mr. Trudeau, the Quebecers are denouncing the concessions made in the dairy sector, and Mr. Couillard says that he's going to use the means in his power to delay the implementation of the agreement. He's looking at his options. Does that worry you? And what can you do concretely to address this? First of all, I'd like to speak directly to dairy producers in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada. We have protected supply management. I know that there are certain moments of anxiety, but we're going to work with you and the dairy sector in Quebec and across the country to ensure that we are putting in place the necessary and fair compensation to help you to continue to succeed. But we know full well that the American administration targeted the complete scrapping of supply management, and what we did with this agreement was to protect supply management for future generations because it's a system that works. What do you have to say to those who accuse you of having sacrificing the Quebec dairy sector to protect the auto sector? Well, once again, we know that we are in a context we're nearing the end of the election period in Quebec, and there's a lot of impatience, a lot of anxiety. But I know that there are many Quebecers, whether they be small business owners, manufacturers, whether it be the cultural industry, who have seen our cultural industries protected, but also the digital shift protected for the future. Because we've reached this agreement with the U.S. That have enabled us to protect jobs and create more while continuing to protect supply management. So this is going to be a good deal for Quebecers and all Canadians.
Prime Minister, this deal does nothing to remove the steel aluminium tariffs. The USW just called it a sellout. When are those tariffs going to be removed?
We recognize that 232 has been in place since the Kennedy administration, and a trade deal was not going to be able to change such a core element of U.S. policy around national security that has been there since the 60s. We also recognize that moving forward on eliminating the tariffs on steel and aluminum remains a priority for us, for Mexico, and something that the Americans have indicated that they are more than willing to work on. So we're going to continue discussing that issue and other issues between our two countries in a positive, good faith way, knowing that we've made significant progress and that there's always more to do.
Ambassador McNaughton last week was quite eloquent when he talked about the need for this new agreement to provide an effective curb against Americans imposing tariffs on Canada. You're going into this deal with the 232s and the steel and aluminium still on. What confidence do you have that in 5, 6, 7 months' time the President's going to lose his temper with you and say, okay, those Canadians, they're going to get tariffs on, boom?
Well, we know, first of all, on the 232 issue, there's been a lot of discussion of 232 on cars. And what we were able to negotiate with the Americans on this is protection for the Canadian auto industry and auto parts industry from 232 measures on autos that the President might move forward with. So we know that protecting our auto industry was one of the core concerns that Canadians had about getting to a deal, and we're glad to say that we have significant protections for our auto industry. We've also moved forward on certain measures that are a bit of an insurance policy against 232 in general, an exception for Canada, and a longer implementation period, a delay of 60 days before any measures come in that will allow us to work with our American friends and neighbors to try and find solutions before 232 moves forward.
Josh Wingrove, Bloomberg.
To follow up on the steel tariffs, that 60-day sort of window that you mentioned, will that kick in for the steel and aluminum tariffs?
No. Christian, do you want to...
We're pushing the next 60 days to get that lifted. Is there any correlation between signing the deal November 30th and having these tariffs lifted?
The 60-day measure that the Prime Minister mentioned is a special agreement between Canada and the United States, acknowledging the closeness of our trading relationship and the fact that we have a very special security relationship. And according to this provision, future 232 tariffs, if they were applied to countries in the world, Canada would have a special 60-day consultation period for us to try to work things out. I think that is a good thing. When it comes to steel and aluminum, Josh, our position is unchanged. We have felt from day one that trade in steel between Canada and the United States is balanced and mutually beneficial. As you know, the United States has a slight surplus, in fact. And we think the best outcome, the best economic outcome for both countries would be for both countries to remove those tariffs. That's something that we've been actively discussing with the United States since the imposition of the tariffs. We're going to continue to do that. And certainly, as the Prime Minister said, we have some momentum now, having concluded this deal. And we are definitely looking to take advantage of that momentum to intensify conversations about steel and aluminum.
Can I just ask, when things changed, was there a turning point? It seems like things really picked up in the last week. Was there a particular day or a particular subject that you think really got things moving, broke a logjam?
You know, there have been a lot of turning points. I actually think the real historic turning point was when Ambassador Lighthizer decided that the 50% domestic content provision, which was in the initial U.S. negotiating positions, the 50% domestic content for car parts, when he decided that that was not going to be his approach, and we worked instead together on the labor value content. I think that was probably the single pivotal moment, and I think from then on we felt that the outline of a deal was there. We could see a landing zone, and the question for us at that point became, how do we get there?
Est-ce que vous voulez répéter en français juste la dernière réponse?
Would you like to repeat the last response in French, please? Yes. Obviously, in all negotiations, there are low and high points. And when the United States, and Ambassador Lighthizer in particular, were decided to be open to the 50% domestic production for auto parts, we started to see that there was a path to an agreement. Up until then, we knew that it would be a major challenge, but when we saw that, yes, we would be able to reach an agreement on auto that would be good for Canada, the United States, and Mexico, that's when we saw that there would be a way forward in modernizing NAFTA so that it would be win-win-win, and we got there.
Sentence there, that the labor value content idea, that's a really creative idea. It's new to trade agreements, and I really want to give credit to Ambassador Lighthizer and his team for working on that. We actually had a lot of fun developing it together, and it goes to where there is the core shared interest of Canada and the United States, which is the reality that we have workers in both of our countries who feel their jobs have been eroded because of trade agreements. This element that we have in our modernized North American trade agreement gives some real comfort to manufacturing workers in high-wage countries, and we were able to accomplish this because that is a shared interest of Canada and the United States and of our administrations.
Mélanie Marquis, Presse Canadienne.
Prime Minister Trudeau, this is the third time in as many agreements that the dairy producers lose out. You were talking about 50% of dairy production in Quebec, so we're 1 year out from the elections. Are you sure that this is not going to harm people running in Quebec? Answer. On the contrary, this agreement is going to be good for Quebecers and Canadians, for manufacturers, for business, for our workers in cultural industries. It's excellent news for consumers. We know that Quebecers, like all Canadians, realize that it's a good thing to have stability, to have access, to have an agreement that's going to protect middle-class jobs and prosperity in the long term. Now, we do recognize that with regard to dairy producers, there are concerns, and once again, I can reassure you that we have protected supply management for the future, and because it is a system that works and will continue to work for Canada. And with regard to market share that was given, we're going to work with the industry to ensure that adequate compensation will allow it to continue to succeed. But you know that today is Election Day in Quebec, and did you contact the outgoing Premier Couillard and the other political leaders to tell them what was coming forward? Well, for weeks and months now, I've been in very close consultation with all provincial premiers. In fact, since the beginning of the negotiations, I have held a number of calls with the premiers to keep them abreast of our approach and elements that were being discussed. And clearly, Premier Couillard was very clear with regard to his concerns throughout our conversations. And in fact, we had a number of opportunities to talk about this directly together. We held a call with the provincial premiers this morning to discuss how we would move forward. And yes, there were concerns on the part of Premier Couillard with regard to the deal that was reached for the dairy producers. But as I said, we are going to work very closely with the industry, and we have secured the future of supply management because we know that Americans wanted to dismantle it completely.
I'm wondering if either the Prime Minister or Minister Freeland can walk us through the past 72 hours and sort of share some of the color inside the room. When did you know that you were close to a deal? Was there some sort of aha moment that you had it? And what was the reaction in the room once an agreement was reached?
I think we have all been through moments over the course of these negotiations where we felt very close only to see it not end up working out. So I think we were all very mindful that there was a definite window now where the midnight deadline by the United States to send the text to Congress was a very real deadline that gave us an opportunity to work towards it. But I have to say, from my own perspective, there wasn't a single aha moment. There was just a series of, okay, we got this one settled. Wow, okay, we still got to talk about this one, and it's not done yet. But there was this sense that when things were falling into place, I think one of the moments for me was when we realized that we had an intact Chapter 19. That was where I started to realize, okay, you know what? I think we're going to be able to get to a place because we've kept in place the rules that protect trade and enforce trade agreements like this.
En français, s'il vous plaît.
Okay. Je pense que au fil des
In French, please. Well, I would say that over the months, there were many times when we felt a lot of momentum and then all of a sudden things didn't work out. So I wouldn't say that there was one specific moment during our conversations over the weekend where we said, okay, this is good, we've got it. No, it really happened at the last minute. But there were obviously a number of small positive signs. Once we achieved something, then we moved forward to the next thing, and we were very clear on our expectations for Canadians as to what a good deal was. But a key moment for me was when we realized that we were going to have an intact Chapter 19. That was a priority for Canada to keep those rules in place, the rules that govern dispute resolution. And when we got there, that was an excellent sign for me.
I would add, Katie, is, remember when we were all together in August of last year and we started the journey that we took together. And I predicted that there would be moments of drama. And I also spoke about our confidence that at the end of the day, the economic logic behind this relationship meant we really believed it was going to be possible to modernize NAFTA in a way that was good for everyone. And that core conviction of ours, which we hold because it is the truth, that has been our compass here. And it's easy to be overtaken by the dramatic moments, but we have not been. And we have always just focused on the reality that this is a good deal for everyone. And we've always believed that we were going to get here, right, Prime Minister?
As a follow-up in English, I'm wondering if you can speak to the compensations that you'll be providing to Canadian dairy farmers. Also, consideration, will there be compensation to poultry farmers and some of the other agricultural sectors that have been caught off guard by some of the concessions in this deal?
So, as we said, our supply-managed producers will be fully compensated because that is the fair thing to do. We want to be sure that the compensation is carefully thought through, and we have begun that process already. And I'd like to remind people that there is still a road to travel before this agreement, this modernized agreement, is ratified and enters into force. And we are going to use that time really thoughtfully and carefully to be sure we get the compensation right. But I do want to emphasize that is a clear commitment of our government.
Hélène Bouzari, Le Devoir.
Prime Minister Trudeau, there are a number of concerns with regard to supply management. There are even leaders who said that they would block it. So I would like to know whether you are concerned whether Quebec is going to block this agreement. Well, first of all, we understand that it's election time, so obviously that's ramping up the rhetoric. But as we usually do, as we always do, we're going to work with provinces and premiers across the country to make sure that we move forward in the right way, in respect and targeting prosperity for all. We hear the concerns from the dairy sector. But as we said, we did protect supply management, and we're going to compensate dairy producers. We're going to work closely with them to ensure that all goes well. And for all sectors across Canada and Quebec, this is good news. Is it possible that Quebec might block this agreement? Well, I'm very eager to have these conversations with the Quebec government in the days and weeks to come. But I know that having secured jobs and the free trade agreement with the United States is excellent news for all Canadians, including Quebecers.
Politics.
Prime Minister, how can you say that you've kept supply management intact when you've agreed to eliminate Class 7 and Class 6, as well as set significant limits on Canadian dairy exports?
We continue to have a supply management system that ensures that Canadian milk producers are able to sell their high-quality products to Canadians. We have a supply management system that continues to be very much in place to protect both our agricultural sector and our consumers. This is something that continues. We have made modifications to the way it works, but we also know that it is something that will ensure the viability and the strength of supply management for years to come.
Minister Freeland, Minister Wilson from Ontario says he was told that steel and aluminum tariffs would be eradicated completely. Is that true?
Well, I can't speak to all conversations people might have, but I have certainly been clear from the outset that the 232 issues and the NAFTA negotiations are entirely separate. 232 is a national security consideration. It has never been part of the NAFTA negotiation. Having said that, Of course, we think both Canada and the United States would be in a better place if neither country were imposing tariffs on our very balanced, highly integrated steel and aluminum sectors and therefore our manufacturing sectors. So that's something we continue to discuss with the United States. And as I also said, we have a little bit of wind in our sails, and we are going to very much continue to work on this issue. But it is separate from the NAFTA talks.
Guillaume Saint-Pierre, Journal de Québec.
Oui,
no, sorry.
On n'a pas de questions.
No questions.
Monsieur Trudeau.
Prime Minister Trudeau, you said earlier that the preservation of Chapter 19 was your most satisfactory gain. But what about the concessions that made you the most upset? Well, obviously, we had very clear expectations with regard to this agreement. We wanted to preserve the rules-based system in Chapter 19. We wanted to preserve our cultural exemptions, and we wanted to preserve supply management. Obviously, when we had to make a certain movement on dairy, that was not ideal. But it is something we knew that we could do while protecting our supply management system and ensure that our dairy producers can continue to succeed and have a bright future in Canada. Well, with regard to other aspects, really the positive aspect of having, in a globally uncertain environment, having secured our place in the North American trade situation is good for Canadians. This morning, in a press conference, President Trump had many good words for the Mexican president. But he was a bit colder with regard to you. We had a very good conversation this morning, President Trump and I. We were very pleased to have reached this historic deal. But obviously, as I have always said, the relationship between the United States and Canada is much deeper than any two individuals who might be Prime Minister and President. I will continue to have constructive relations with the American President, but I will also continue to be invested in the needs and values of Canadian citizens.
Throughout this, the government was saying that you didn't believe Sunday night was a real deadline, that there was no real deadline. But today it sounds like you very much thought it was a real deadline. So when did that become apparent in the negotiations? The Americans were serious and there might be some sort of consequence if you missed it.
Well, I think actually to flip that around a bit, it became clear when we started to see the things that we had said were absolute necessities in us accepting a deal, that they began to move on them, that we realized that they really did want to get this done before the midnight deadline. And for us, as you know, we've tried to work towards all the deadlines that had been put forward, but we weren't concerned about deadlines as much as we were concerned about getting the right deal for Canadians, getting a good deal for Canada. And when that deal came together yesterday afternoon and evening, it wasn't about the deadline, it was about the deal actually coming together.
If you missed the deadline, did you have an indication from the Americans that tariffs would kick in today?
We didn't miss the deadline.
If you did.
I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals. We worked very hard. We got to the right deal. We got to a win-win-win for all three countries.
Maxime Bergeron, La Presse.
Yes, the sunset clause was extremely important in the negotiations. That seems to have been settled, at least in part. Can you give any concrete details on the mechanism of renegotiation every 6 years, and do you think that will be sufficient to reboost the investments that have dropped in Canada? No, I'm fine. Oh. Well, I just wanted to say that the conversations that we've had today with investors, with banks, with people who are very happy that we have been able to secure the future of North American trade, well, they're very positive, and we expect to hear a lot of good things with regard to the investment community. That's an excellent question. Thank you. And you are correct. The sunset clause was a very important issue for Canada at the beginning of the negotiations. When the Americans called for a 5-year sunset clause, and the structure of that idea was that without a positive decision on the part of the leaders, NAFTA would fail. And we found a compromise. A compromise is a compromise that is normal for Canada. As you said, it is 6 years, and after a certain amount of time, it will go to 10 years. So I think, yes, so it's 6 years and 10 years. Fully. And I think that for investors, yes, I know, Joyce, it's a bit complex, but the initial period is 6 years. After 6 years, we will have a period during which all 3 countries can have a conversation among leaders and decide how the agreement will work at that time. If everything is good, then it's good. If there are problems, then we will have 10 years to discuss. So it's a clause that I think is perfectly normal, perfectly logical for investors. And I must say as well that Ambassador Lighthizer will allow me to say so. He told me directly that the position of Prime Minister Trudeau on the sunset clause was very important for him and for Americans. And the fact that we were able to come to this compromise was because Ambassador Lighthizer knew that how important it was for Prime Minister Trudeau. Another thing that you have to remember is that within NAFTA, there was always this clause that allowed any country to withdraw for any reason with only 6 months' notice. So what we were able to do with this agreement was to create a horizon of 6 years so that at least we could get beyond any president to look to the future with some security.
John Iveson from Post Media, take the last 2 questions. You didn't have your phone, sorry. I'm conscious of time. Can we go really quickly?
So in those 14 months, were there any moments where you really thought that it would be impossible to reach a deal? Answer. Well, there were moments of enthusiasm. There were moments of, well, I wouldn't say despair, but we just weren't sure that we would be able to get there. And those were frustrating moments because we saw how important this was to the interests of Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. to reach a good agreement. So, yes, I might say there were moments of pessimism, yes, but through all of that, we knew that we would be able to work and that we would be able to get there, and obviously we're very happy today.
John? The agreement seems to open the door to Washington having influence on future trade negotiations with a non-market player like China. How much influence is the U.S. likely to have on any talks with China?
Well, one of the things that we know is that trade diversification is an extremely important part of growing the Canadian economy, and we're going to continue to engage in increasing our trade footprint around the world. Canada is a trading nation, and we will always look to deepen and strengthen our economic ties with countries around the world. But on that specific issue?
Yeah, I think, John, you must be referring to the non-market economy clause. And what I would say about that is what that clause does is it gives any one of the NAFTA countries the ability, if it chooses, upon the entry into force of a trade agreement between another NAFTA partner and a non-market economy, the other NAFTA partner may choose to exit the accord. That's something, as the Prime Minister pointed out in our Sunset Clause conversation, that is a possibility which exists no matter what. NAFTA, like any trade agreement, has a way for parties to leave, and that's essential. We as a country would never be bound by an agreement which allowed no departure. So there has always been, from the moment that NAFTA entered into force, and this exists in all of our trade deals, the option for a NAFTA country to leave NAFTA. The non-market economy element gives the country the opportunity to say, as a result of the decision of one NAFTA partner to enter into a trade agreement with a non-market economy, that could be a reason to leave. But in the 2205 6-month withdrawal mechanism, you don't need a reason to leave, and you shouldn't. You know, each country should have the right to make a sovereign decision about whether it wants to remain in a trade agreement. That has always been the case with NAFTA. It continues to be the case with NAFTA. And speaking for Canada, and I think this is something we would all agree with, we would never enter into a trade agreement that we didn't have the option at some future point to decide didn't work for our country.
In the early going, there was a lot of talk about progressive trade agenda, yet in the final agreement, there's very little mention made of Indigenous or gender rights. Was that an unnecessary distraction?
A progressive trade agenda is one that recognizes that trade deals are good to create growth, but don't necessarily ensure that the benefits of growth go to everyone. And when we talk about progressive trade, it's about ensuring that the middle class and those working hard to join it, small businesses, marginalized communities have opportunities to succeed with this trade agreement. And that is something that we have woven throughout this agreement, and it is something that, quite frankly, Canadians expect. And we've moved forward with CETA in a way that benefits everyone, the CPTPP in ways to make sure that there are benefits to everyone, and indeed on the USMCA in ways that benefits everyone. That is something that Canadians expect of us, and it is something that we are going to continue to ensure that that happens in these trade deals. We need to make sure that everyone benefits from these, and that's what we've been expecting.
And if I could add, John, this is in fact a very progressive trade agreement. The environment chapter is enforceable. It is much stronger than previous environment chapters. That is a very progressive outcome. The labor chapter is significantly stronger, and that is a very significant progressive outcome. And as discussed earlier, the labor value content idea embedded in the rules of origin, this is all about protecting high-wage workers in a trade agreement. And I can think of nothing that is more central to the progressive agenda than that. Having said that, there is also some good language on Indigenous issues and on gender in the agreement too, and we'll be happy to point it out to you.
Do you want a snappy round? 3 last questions?
Actually, we have question period in about a half an hour.
Thank you for doing this.
Merci tout le monde.
That concludes our news of today.